You know the feeling when you start a series and think it's okay, maybe it has some promising moments, but it ultimately fails to capture your attention and you lose interest in it, and intervals between you watching the next episode become longer and longer and you eventually just stop watching it. That's more or less what happened with me and Bungo Stray Dogs. I liked the start, but season 1 felt like it wasn't really going anywhere with its story. Sure, there was the conflict between the armed detective agency and port mafia, but that didn't feel all that interesting to me. I didn't dislike anything, but I also didn't see what made Bungo Stray Dogs stand out and why I should watch it instead of any other anime. Then I reached season 2 and its dark era flashback arc and was almost shocked by its different way of storytelling, especially in comparison to season 1, and way darker tone than anything Bungo Stray Dogs had shown so far in its anime. If you don't know, Bungo Stray Dogs anime doesn't only adapt the manga but also the official light novel, and every season apart from the newest has a few episodes adapting a light novel arc. These arcs are generally more interesting to me than the main plot and are almost all flashback arcs. The writing and story in these are overall more engaging and a lot more serious than the main plot. Just my opinion of course, but I found these arcs to be way less filled with the typical anime tropes you see so often, and watching the Dark Era arc after season 1 felt like I'd found the reason as to why I should watch Bungo Stray Dogs. I'm not going to spoil anything, but this arc with its new protagonist Oda and seeing Dazai in his more savage and cold-blooded days was outstanding and easily one of the best flashbacks in all of anime. The story felt more serious and emotional, and every character had something interesting about them, particularly Oda and Dazai, and by the way, Oda's ability to see a few seconds in the future has to be one of the coolest in the series. After this amazing arc, the writing of the main story felt underwhelming in comparison, and after a few more episodes in season 2 I stopped watching. I believe this was about the time season 3 came out, so I thought to myself that I should stop now after finishing such a great arc and wait until more Bungo Stray Dogs is out, so that I could binge watch the rest of season 2 and 3 and hopefully soon reach another outstanding moment that would stop me from comparing everything that comes after to the moment the series peaked for me. Some time passed while I watched other stuff and didn't feel the urge to return to Bungo Stray Dogs. I just randomly thought about the Dark Era arc from time to time, and so eventually season 4 was announced, and it finally convinced me to start Bungo Stray Dogs again from the beginning and finally catch up. Okay, I'm sorry for this long intro, but the whole reason I'm taking my time talking about all of this is while I still don't think that anything in seasons 1 to 3 compares story and writing-wise to the Dark Era, there were many enjoyable moments worth watching, and that finally leads me to seasons 4 and 5, released a few months back. These seasons, especially season 5, are what I had been waiting for all this time. The moment the main story really takes off and presents a story and characters far more interesting to me than anything the main story had shown prior. No, I know these seasons aren't perfect, but they managed to tell a story that's unique and vastly different from anything in Bungo Stray Dogs up to that point. Not spoiling anything, but something happens in the middle of season 4 that changes the character dynamics between the armed detective agency and everyone else to the point the story structure shifts from the way it had been in the story previously to something new entirely. The moment that happened is when Bungo Stray Dogs started becoming really interesting and unique in my eyes again, and I just want to say that I'm grateful to experience so many great moments and stories I previously stopped watching and decided to start again. The same happened with Mob Psycho, and there are multiple other anime I thought were okay at first that surprised me by how good they actually turned out to be when I decided to go back and give them another try. And I'm happy to say Bungo Stray Dogs is another one where exactly that happened. There's a greater focus on secondary characters who haven't had as much screen time before and who have grown on me since. The antagonists are also way more engaging because you no longer only have these evil masterminds working against the main cast. There are new antagonists more complex in their motivation where you don't really know which side they ultimately end on. And I have to say season 5's finale is probably my favorite Bungo Stray Dogs episode so far. It's a wonderful end to the current arc, and I'm eagerly awaiting a new season or movie or whatever comes next, even though it will probably take another 3 or so years for the manga to have enough material for an anime adaptation again. One of the reasons I think seasons 4 and 5 were so interesting to me is because they had a big focus on side characters, and you got to know new interesting characters as well as learn more about some that were present from season 1 but never really got to stand in the spotlight, like Yosano and a certain Port Mafia member who I'm not going to name, but if you're up to date with the anime then you know who I mean. The armed detectives in general play a way bigger role in the story than they did previously, and what I mean by that is that the story revolves more around them, in comparison to season 2 or 3 for example, where they're of course an important part of this story, but it's more about the 3 antagonistic factions and what the detectives do in response to their actions, in contrast to season 4 and 5, where the armed detectives are basically pushed to take action first instead of reacting to what the other factions do. This puts the focus more on the individual members and what they decide to do, and since seasons 4 and 5 have less of a focus on the members with the most screen time so far, Dazai and Kunikida, most of the other members get to shine. Kenji probably has double if not triple the screen time he had in seasons 1 to 3 combined, and Yosano has one of my absolute favorite episodes, and is generally way more important than she was before, where most of her time was spent healing and terrifying other members. You get to learn about her as a person and what she values, and after not really caring about her up to that point, she might be one of my favorite characters in the series now. And I think it's a shame that we only now get to learn more about so many of the characters that were here since episode 1 and spent most of their screen time in the background, where there was just enough of them to know the most basic defining character traits, but you didn't really get much depth until now 4 or 5 seasons deep into the story. And don't get me wrong, I really loved learning more about these characters, and I think most of what was shown made the individual armed detective agency members a lot more interesting and gave them some much needed depth. But on the other hand, I feel it's a shame to only now learn all that information, since this is just me, but if they had been given more focus in previous seasons that goes beyond the relatively basic character traits you get to see up until now, these characters could have left a bigger impression and show how interesting they can actually be if given enough presence in the story. And I just want to say that I don't want it to sound like I think these characters were badly written or anything up until seasons 4 and 5. I just think that, of course, these characters weren't that interesting to me or possibly anyone else when they got not enough screen time to show more of their identity than what you can see on the surface in a short interaction. So all I want to say is that I'm glad the armed detective agency members with less of a presence in the story so far finally get their time to shine, and another character where that's the case is Fukuzawa. Since he is the boss of the agency, he always had at least some kind of importance to the story, either when giving orders to others or when interacting with the port mafia, but you didn't really know much about him as a person or anything else that goes beyond his role as the boss of the agency. And with how the story is going now, he finally gets to do more than show up from time to time and talk for a little while before disappearing again. By that I not only mean that you get to see what he's capable of in a fight, you already got to see a little bit of that, like in Dead Apple for example, even though now you get to see more of his tactics and it's definitely cool. But like with the other agency members, he gets way more of a focus, and what I said for Yosano is also true for him. You have multiple instances where you learn more about his past, who he is, and what led him to found the agency. And starting from the season 4 flashback light novel arc where he shares his screen time with another important character who I'm going to talk about in just a second, he gets more focus on himself and his closest relationships, and I'm again glad that we finally get to learn more about a character who has been here from the start, but so far didn't matter that much as a person and more as the boss of the agency. And now it's time to finally talk about the character who probably got the most screen time in the story recently, only behind the main character Atsushi, even though he's also less of a side character and more of a main character now, Rampo. Now, before I talk about what I thought of his role in recent arcs, I first want to talk about my opinions on him in previous seasons. As far as I know, Rampo has always been a fan favorite since his first major appearance in season 1, and I can see why. He's smart and confident, is voiced by a fantastic voice actor, and still has flaws that make him not just overly competent in every field and can provide many comedic moments. He's of course also the only one in the agency who doesn't actually have an ability and is still one of the most important, if not the most important part of the agency. These are just some of the reasons I could imagine made him a favorite of many, but I have to say I didn't like him all that much up until season 4. With confident characters, it's often either the case that I really like them or find them a little annoying or simply just arrogant and therefore don't enjoy seeing them. When such a character can prove that their confidence is actually justified and they are not just arrogant but can actually show that they are more than capable in whatever they are doing, then I oftentimes change my mind on them and grow to really like them, or if they have an understandable reason for the way they act and have a lot of other aspects to them that make me sympathize or just like them in general, then I oftentimes not only grow to like them but really appreciate their writing. And some of my favorite characters I started with really disliking and eventually changing my mind and loving them, like Kaguya or Nino for example, and there are multiple other examples. Some of these characters are written to not be that likable in general at the start, like Nino, where you slowly learn more about them and not only understand why they are the way they are, but they possibly changed throughout the story, and that can make for a really interesting character, I think. Best conchable, by the way. And others, like Kaguya for example, have that confidence and slight arrogance, but aren't written to be dislikable. They may have multiple flaws, but the story doesn't have the intention to make you dislike them, I'm pretty sure. But at least I just did not like Kaguya that much in season 1. Now after rewatching season 1, I liked her way more, and she's easily one of my favorite characters on Love is War after seasons 2 and 3. But on my first watch, I just thought of her as too arrogant and just didn't really like her. And I'm pretty sure I'm in the minority there, and most likely from the start, but I just want to say that some characters may be written to be likable, but for one reason or another just don't click for me, and I'm sure most have at least one character others love who they just don't or didn't like. And that's kinda how it was with Rampo for me. I didn't really dislike him, but there was not that much for me that made me like him apart from his voice actor. I think one of the reasons is that even though I think it's great to have this genius character without an ability who can just solve almost any crime or riddle with his mind, at least for me it's important to actually get a glimpse of what's going on in his head, to make it kind of believable how he figured something out. If he just had an ability that allowed him to solve anything, then it wouldn't be necessary to show how he got to a certain conclusion. The answer would just be that his supernatural ability did it, and that would be enough. But once he can figure out almost impossible answers for any other person without much investigation, I think it's important to show at least sometimes how he got to a conclusion, because at that point it's supposed to be believable that he could theoretically figure something out from the clues he got. Most other people just wouldn't, because he just thinks that much further than anyone else. And to make that believable and in return show why his confidence is justified, I personally just would have liked to see more of his thought process, so that I can understand that what he's doing is actually possible, and any other person, me included, just would have never thought that far. And apart from his first case with Atsushi, where Dazai explains a lot of what could have gone through Rampo's mind, or at least how Dazai got to a conclusion, and therefore Rampo also could have, and a certain moment in season 5 where most people watching probably came to the conclusion he comes to before he does, just because you as a viewer got the information that this is a fictional story and therefore can come to conclusions to how the story will develop, just because it's written by a person who probably wants to tell a cohesive story, and therefore you as a viewer or reader can conclude the direction a plot point will go based on knowledge of other fictional works like anime with similar plot points. And of course there's also scenes shown to viewers that not every character gets to see, so you know information impossible for them to know. But apart from that, the show doesn't show how Rampo is able to figure out these almost impossible scenarios with a very limited amount of clues. For me there just weren't enough moments in seasons 1 to 3 that showed me why he got to a conclusion, and I don't think it's important to show it every time or even show more than a few of his thoughts that helped him figure something out, but I can't think of another moment in the first 3 seasons apart from the first that got into detail of how he arrived at an answer. And when he's that important to the agency and helps them out that much with his knowledge, then I just would have wished for more of an explanation of how he theoretically, believably figured something out. Because when that's not the case, then that in turn doesn't show his confidence is justified, even though I technically know that it is. There was just the part missing that made it believable for me as a viewer, and that might just be me alone. But when a character is supposed to be smart, then I just like to see the process behind their thinking, because it's of course easier to say a character is smart than actually show it. And that's what makes characters like Light and L or Lelouch so interesting when looking at their strategies and how they arrived at a solution, because there are a lot of instances where you get shown what's going on in their head, and you get to see them being smart rather than seeing the aftermath and leaving out the process. And that is one of the reasons these characters are so fascinating. Okay, so with all of that talk, I just want to say that the reason I didn't like him that much in seasons 1 to 3 is that I was missing a bit of that thought process that made him believable to me, and understandable that he was way smarter than I could ever be, and if that's his most defining character trait and it's often used but not made believable enough for me personally, then it's harder for me to like him as a character. But like I mentioned, most of that changed for me with seasons 4 and 5. And while one aspect is that you see more of his thought process, the biggest aspect of why I changed my mind about him is that he's given more of a personality outside of him being ridiculously intelligent. There's just so much more that makes him human in these arcs, starting from the flashback arc with Fukuzawa. Both get so much more interesting with a part of their past revealed, and you see just so much they both mean to each other. And Rampo is just so sweet in Yosono's flashback. His time with Po is also fantastic and shows some interesting parts of his personality and relationships. I just think it's great to finally learn more about all of these characters. I of course like Atsushi as a main character, but the side characters in Bungo Stray Dogs can be so interesting if just given enough screen time and depth. And Rampo, like all the other Armed Detective Agency members who got more of a focus on in these past few episodes, are a perfect example of that. There are a few other characters I want to talk about, and I won't spoil anything specific, but if you haven't seen seasons 4 and 5, and for whatever reason got this far in the video and don't want to know about any newer characters, then this might be a good place to stop the video and watch these newer seasons, even though they've already been out for a few months. But since it will probably take a few years until the continuation of the anime, or even some time for new chapters, this will most likely be as far as the story will go for some time, until the manga catches up to the anime and the anime eventually gets a continuation, or even a conclusion of the story if the author decides to end the story after the current or next arc, what could be possible when looking at how the story went so far. Okay, so I tried to keep my next couple of thoughts short, but I'm glad Bungo Stray Dogs used Dazai and by extension also Fyodor the way it did in seasons 4 and 5. I mentioned before that the absence, or at least shortage, of Dazai and Kunikida for a huge amount of the story was a really good decision in my eyes, because it not only allowed for the other side characters to have more screen time, it also made the limited screen time these two had that much more interesting. Kunikida, of course, being tested on his resolve and what his ideals truly mean to him was important for his character, I feel like, and Dazai's lack of appearances for most of season 4 made the scenes where we finally do see him that much more interesting. I think the battle of wits between Dazai and Fyodor was probably one of the most entertaining parts for me, and was made even better after Nikolai and Sigma joined them. I also didn't expect to like Sigma that much, but the contrast and different view he presented when compared to these other three insane characters was something that fitted quite well. I know the show compared him a few times to Atsushi, and I can see why, and while I like Atsushi, I honestly think that Sigma was more interesting to me personally than the main character. Atsushi works fine as a main character, and I definitely don't dislike him, but I wish the show would give him more of a complex personality sometimes, and I understand that he's not less interesting than a lot of other action anime and manga protagonists, and that they generally do tend to be more of a basic character. But since Bungo Stray Dogs, especially now after seasons 4 and 5, has so many side characters that might be more interesting than the main character, I would just wish for him to also finally get a little more depth. I just think it's a shame that Oda, in only 4 episodes as a main character, managed to land a bigger impression on me than Atsushi in over 60. But I still like him, and he does get a few interesting moments from time to time, like with Akutagawa for example, who I also started with thinking that he's just okay, and then liking him more and more as seasons went by. And I'd say he might be at his most interesting point character-wise in season 5. The most important characters in these newer arcs, besides the decay of the Angel members, the Hunting Dogs, were also one of my favorite additions to the story, because they were the first antagonistic faction with an actual morally justifiable reason to fight the armed detective agency, and that alone made them already interesting enough. The members also have more of an interesting personality, I feel, than most of the members of previous antagonistic factions. Of course, excluding characters like Chuya or Akutagawa or Fyodor, for example. My favorite Hunting Dogs were their leader and secret member, both for obvious reasons, but the other members also were more interesting than I initially assumed. I just have to say I think that Bungo Stray Dogs finally found its unique identity with seasons 4 and 5, and I hope it keeps that momentum after that final episode. I think the last episode of season 5 might be the best so far, and while I think that it, as well as seasons 4 and 5 as a whole, managed to go into a very interesting direction with the story, there's also one minor issue I have with Bungo Stray Dogs that I just want to talk about briefly, and that is that I think that not enough characters are dying. Now, I'm of course not saying that I just want characters to be killed off for no reason, but when looking at how often characters, and specifically armed detective agency members, got into life-threatening circumstances, then I feel like there aren't enough consequences. There aren't even any long-lasting injuries due to Yosano, and while that by itself is completely fine, the problem is that with so many moments where the show wants you to believe that characters might be dying, or at least losing any limbs, and with how often characters lose twice their possible amount of blood, I just wish for more consequences. There were multiple scenarios where certain agency members could have died or got other long-lasting consequences that were just resolved without any problem in the end. And while I don't think that by itself has to be anything bad, real consequences to character actions would give back the feeling of real danger. Because when Atsushi, for example, gets injured, then I don't really feel anything. After all, he will just be healed, and it's more or less the same for everyone else in the agency. Of course, with the way season 5 ends, 2 major characters might be dead, and I truly hope that at least the character you see dying is actually dead, and the other way you're led to believe they're dead without seeing a full corpse might be dead as well, even though they still have the potential for some interesting plot points should they turn out to be alive and return. In an age where it's becoming more and more common for shonen and other action anime and manga to kill some of the major characters, I just feel like when not at least one beloved character dies sooner or later, or at least has some real and serious long-lasting consequences, be it physically or mentally, the sense of danger that the antagonists are supposed to radiate is just harder to buy into, at least in my opinion. But that's more or less all I had in my mind after finally finishing season 5 of Bungo Stray Dogs. Overall, I think that the story went in a really interesting direction, and these last few episodes were definitely my favorite besides the Dark Era arc. If the show manages to keep this momentum and does still continue for at least one longer arc, because the teaser for the next big battle at the end of season 5 does kind of feel like a preview for the final confrontation, or at least for the final antagonist, then I think it has the potential for a fantastic action anime and manga that will be remembered by those few that actually saw it for quite some time. I also wish that with the quality of these latest seasons, and hopefully next season, Bungo Stray Dogs will gain some attention and more people will watch it, because while I think that a good amount of people have watched season 1, not nearly enough stuck around up until now and have seen how great this series can become. And just one last thing, if you like the latest seasons or just Bungo Stray Dogs in general, then I would recommend looking up some of the real life inspirations for these characters and abilities, because they can be very interesting when comparing them to the Bungo Stray Dogs counterpart. Since all of these characters are based on real people, you can actually see some interesting inspirations the author took that influenced the way some characters act. Like why Rampo likes Po, for example, or why Dazai acts the way he does. That's also something I think is great about Bungo Stray Dogs, that convinced me and possibly anyone else to learn about these real people that served as a basis for the fictional characters in the story. I knew about Edgar Allan Poe or Osamu Dazai and what part of the real person got taken into the character in some way, but learning about the real Fyodor or Yosano and what part of their life or personality or works influenced the character was really fascinating to find out about, and I promise it's way more interesting than it might sound right now to you. So I highly recommend to learn more about the real life influences for Bungo Stray Dogs. But anyway, I wish you a great rest of the day, and bye.